Good evening. My name is Jocelyn Wong. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator here at the Nantucket Historical Association. Welcome to the relaunch of the NHA's Food for Thought series. The program tonight will include a presentation followed by a Q&A session. So if you have a question for our speaker, please submit it in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will try and address as many questions as our time together tonight will allow for. This evening, we will hear from Neil Foley. Neil is the Interpretive Education Coordinator and Ecologist at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. Growing up in upstate New York, Neil first arrived on the island in 2014 to serve as the Coatue Ranger and Shorebird Monitor for 6 seasons. Neil received a bachelor's in environmental biology from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and a master's in conservation biology from Central Michigan University. His master's thesis focused on the nesting ecology of Nantucket's double-crested cormorants. Through his year-round work at NCF, Neil engages people of all ages and backgrounds with the natural and cultural history of the island. In fact, I first became acquainted with Neil and his encyclopedic knowledge of Nantucket ecology through one of his excellent NCF guided trail walks last August. So tonight, Neil will tell us the story of Coatue from the geological, ecological, and historical scale, sharing his experience and perspective as the former Coatue Ranger. Positioned on the north side of Nantucket Harbor, the Coskata-Coatue Wildlife Refuge plays a key role in the ecological balance of Nantucket. We will learn about how Coatue has changed over the years, the value it holds, and the future of the refuge when faced with rising seas. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Thank you, Miranda and the Nantucket Historical Association. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get this started. Okay, thank you again. Really honored to be talking about a part of the island that I've spent a lot of time on, that I think is really important to the history of Nantucket, and a place that I hope at the end of this presentation you want to go out and explore a little bit more on your own. And that is the Coskata-Coatue Wildlife Refuge. As Jocelyn said, my current role is the Interpretive Education Coordinator and Ecologist. I use my science background to lead guided experiences across our properties. The organization I work for, the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, is a completely membership and donation-based organization that only exists on Nantucket. And we are now in our 60th year of NCF, started back in 1963, and I am really excited in my current role to be taking people across the island. As Jocelyn kind of give my little intro to the walks and how good they are. If you want to experience them for yourself, I will be leading winter walks through April and starting up a large series of programs this season. So join us at NCF. But most of my time on Nantucket has been spent with a view very similar to this. This is out in First Bend on Coatue. It is one of my favorite views, to see Nantucket town along the horizon in the background. And if I had a sound to pipe into this image, it would be the sound of screaming gulls, because that is usually what you hear when you're out on Coatue during the season. It's a really vibrant, beautiful part of the island that not a lot of people get to go to. You know, it takes a good amount of time to get across by boat or paddling across with kayak. If you're driving with a four-wheel drive vehicle, you have to air down your tires. First, you got to drive over to Wawinnet on the other side of the island, air down your tires, and drive up to an hour or more over soft sand roads to get all the way to the end of Coatue. But it is well worth the adventure. It is a really important part of the iconic shape and history of our island. Coatue is a dynamic ecosystem that is acting as a barrier beach property primarily. It's subjected to wind, wave, and microtidal forces. Microtidal referring to anything that is less than 6 feet of clearance. So we are in that microtidal zone. Longshore currents and cross-shore currents battering the sand and peat and clay that underlays Coatue have really subjected it to a huge amount of influence over the years. And as an accreted barrier beach, it is used to moving around, taking shape over thousands of years. The sand and peat that are found across Coatue took about 6,000 years to settle into the shape that they currently resemble. We know that in large part to the research and work done by Peter Rosen, who is a geologist who was based originally out of UMass Amherst. And he has done some incredible studies on the sediment and structure of Coatue over the years, particularly in reference to the cuspate spits that you can see along the harbor. These spits and these pointed formations that jut into Nantucket Harbor are pretty iconic, and they're actually famous within the geology world, so I'm told. Not exactly tapped into that market, but their formation is really interesting. The combination of wind coming from multiple directions, longshore currents that move sediment from the bends between the points, deposit them at each point, along with the currents coming from the head of the harbor, rounding that harbor over by Walwinet and the Haulover, and going through the only exit down at the channel cut next to Nantucket town. So this shape and structure is really beautiful, really sets Nantucket apart. And the thin nature of this accreted barrier beach has been subjected to a lot of storm influence over the years, particularly being strong winter storms coming from the northeast. In December 1896, there was a storm, winter storm that came through and actually opened up a break in the head of the harbor over at the Haulover. The Haulover is that thin stretch of beach on the east side, north of Walwinet and south of Coskata. The opening caused by this winter storm lasted for about 12 years. We had concurrent flow in and out of the harbor. At its widest point in 1904, it was 1/4 mile wide, and the clearance was about 8 feet. So you could easily run a boat through that. And a lot of people did. The Haulover got its name, however, because when it was closed up before, they would haul dories over that stretch of sand rather than go out the cut of Nantucket Channel and navigate around the shoals. You could actually just sail across Nantucket Harbor, line up some oars, and roll a dory over that dune, and you're out into the East Beach. And next stop is Portugal. So storms have had some strong influence on our island at different points, and Coatue and Great Point are definitely subject to that. But natural accretion happens on this beach thanks to those longshore currents that I mentioned. This is a really striking image comparing an overhead of Coatue Point, the closest point to Nantucket town. And it looks very different between 1940 on the left and 2022 on the right-hand side. A lot of deposition of sediment and a movement, a shifting of the entire point structure. So these forces are constantly at work. We're still eroding and accreting, and that's kind of what life is on Nantucket. It's sand moving around the island in that counterclockwise manner, subjected to those strong currents and storm influence. But the shape of Nantucket has stayed relatively the same. This is a map from 1821. In the first about 50, 60 years of settlement on Nantucket by the English. They took a huge task of mapping out the island. Everything at this era is hand-drawn, so the proportions are a little bit off, but we'll allow it because it's still, you can still see that shape of Coatue, those well-defined cuspate spits and something that really defines the shape of the island. The name Coatue in Coskata Wildlife Refuge is classically referred to and translated in the Wampanoag language as land at the Pine Woods. It was a strategic timber reserve going back into the 1660s. In 1667, there was some town warrants against the felling of green timber in certain parts of the island, being around Long Pond and Ram Pasture and the woods, but Coatue was not long after that. Some actual town warrants to protect that strategic reserve of timber, but there's no indication that pines were in influence out there. Ecologically, it's really not suitable to pine woods. And in fact, it's dominated by red cedar. So that name, Land at the Pine Woods, has kind of always confused me a little bit. Like I come from the North Woods dominated by white pines, and I was like, I can't really see white pines doing well in an ecosystem that has this much salt spray and strong wind influence. So Dr. Elizabeth Little, who revolutionized the archaeology study on Nantucket, and her work is available online thanks to the NHA. She wrote a treatise in 1984 that is the Indian place names of Nantucket Island, and she actually references this translation in particular, saying that the root word in the Wampanoag language for pine tree means is reference to it being a sharp point. And this could actually refer not to the structure of the vegetation out there, but in fact, the structure of the property itself, referring to the neck or the cuspate spits of Coatue as being a sharp point. She noted that similar root words to this have been found in places around New England, such as Cotuit, Cohasset. They usually center around bold and dramatic points of land. So the land of the Pine Woods could refer more to the property itself rather than the vegetation that grows there. And if you've ever been out on Coatue, the cedars are low, they're shrubby, they are really subjected to those strong northeast winds and angled and shaped. Some interesting parts of that 1821 map that I also like to point out is it has the Great Point Lighthouse in there. It was originally constructed in 1784. It burned down thanks to fire in 1816. So this 1821 map would have been the second iteration. They built it out of stone in 1817, and that lasted for a good long time until a storm toppled it over in 1984. Blair Perkins, who is the resident fisherman and weather extraordinaire reference, as well as working heavily with the Marine Mammal Alliance and spends a lot of time on Coatue. He's told me many times that he was the last person, could have been the last person up the lighthouse the day before it toppled over in 1984. And it was rebuilt in 1986, thanks in large part to Senator Edward Kennedy, who secured the funding and made sure that it made the National Registry of Historic Places. So that reconstruction in 1986 is what is currently standing on the property today. This inset also shows the pond at Coskata. Coskata is a pretty significant clay formation out there that supports some richer soils on top of it. If you look at the harbor, if you stand at the edge of the harbor and look towards Coatue, it actually rises up around the landscape. And the pond next to it at this point in history was actually fresh water. It shows a small inlet running down towards the harbor, which is brackish and saltwater. But at this point, it would have actually been freshwater system. That inlet opened up more regularly later in the 1800s. So an interesting thing while looking at some of these older maps. And infrastructure has always been something that is hard to maintain on Coatue. There's a lot of salt spray, a lot of wind, and just not being habitable for most of the year keeps some of these buildings at risk. But one notable structure that was present starting in 1883, when they first started laying out and surveying Coatue, is the Cedar Beach House. It was a place of rest. It was a place of recreation. They had bathing stations. They had a toboggan, and it lasted a good 25 years until it also burned down in a fire. So another Nantucket building lost to the ages. But recreation on Coatue and development was really of interest, particularly in the late 1800s, when that tourism industry was really taking over the town and drawing people towards Nantucket. This is a set of diagrams from 1889, laying out an entire vacation village on Coatue. And the idea that you would sell plots and subdivisions. There was a clubhouse, there was a dance hall, there was bathing houses slated for development. And some of these things were actually constructed. The bathing houses at the Cedar Beach House were built in 1890. Here's some advertisements of what you could do on this interesting construction on the north side, advocating for the best bathing on the shores of Nantucket. So there was a water slide with toboggans, and a lot of people actually took use of this. But by the first couple decades of the 1900s, this had fallen into disrepair. The interest around creating a development on Coatue had waned, and people were looking to more accessible parts of the US to build these vacation dwellings. But Coatue remained. It remained as a really integral part of Nantucket in protection of that harbor ecosystem. It helped to shelter the town of Nantucket from strong northeast winds. And for the people of Nantucket, it provided a place to really get away. Some families bought and purchased land along Coatue. It was actually subdivided into plots, and some families still hold slices of Coatue, what I refer to as little pieces of heaven, for sure. So several families still own private property on Coatue today, but the majority landowners out on the refuge are the Nantucket Conservation Foundation and the trustees, with the small tip of Great Point past the lighthouse being owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was a really important place, like I said, for summer recreation, still an important place for hunting for winter ducks, and just getting away from it all. And really, you go out there and you are as close to town, yet as far away as you can possibly be. I've spent many nights sitting on First Point, watching Brant Point Lighthouse Beacon. No one around me, completely out on the beach alone, but still hearing the clatter of plates and cups and dinner conversation coming from Nantucket town that's just across the boat basin. It's a really special part of the island for that reason. And if anyone has ever driven up to Great Point, which is one of the most popular tourist destinations on the island, it seems like a rite of passage to drive up to Great Point. You can see and take in how incredibly beautiful and important that part of the island is. And people use it for recreation still to this day. Lots of parties. It's one of the most popular places to land a boat. This picture down in the bottom right is from 4th of July a couple summers ago. And as the ranger, I still encounter people that come out of the woodwork say, "Hey, didn't you tell me to put my dog on a leash a couple of years ago?" So that's just something I don't think I will ever escape from. But it is an important place for the adventurous and the people who just want to get away from the hustle and bustle of downtown Nantucket to enjoy each other's company and take in a little bit of extra beauty. And while they're out there, they have the honor to be amongst a cavalcade of characters, one of the most beautiful and biodiverse spots on the island. It is a really important breeding ground for a huge amount of species, particularly birds. There's a large active mixed water bird colony, several hundred pairs of gulls, great back black and herring gulls nest on Coatue every single year. There's a vibrant and healthy population of at-risk salt marsh sparrows. There's a nesting rookery of egrets, both snowy egrets and great egrets, as well as black-crowned night herons. Double-crested cormorants have snuck in the last decade to establish a colony nesting on a coastal foredune. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It is one of the most important breeding sites for American oyster catchers in their entire range, one of the most dense and impactful breeding sites of this species. It is also, as many people point out, an important breeding ground for harbor seals and gray seals, as well as spawning grounds for limulus, the horseshoe crab. So a huge biodiverse load out on the refuge today. And protection of these resources is a lot of why I came to the island. In appreciation of this, I just want to talk very briefly about some of these. We'll start with the uplands. The heathlands and dune systems and dune swales of Coatue are vibrant and beautiful. This time of year, you can usually go out there to spot some snowy owls, but I don't think one has been reported as of now, which is kind of unfortunate. But I've encountered some good winter and early season years where there has been upwards of 15, 16 snowy owls using that property and using different parts of the refuge. Tucked in some of the dune swales and protected is the eastern prickly pear cactus. This species is actually pretty rare for New England. You can find its similarly shaped and similarly colored species, Opuntia humifusa, in different parts of New England, but Opuntia cespitosa, as we've learned in the last couple of years, is a rarity for New England. It is identified by that beautiful bright red-orange center of the flower, and most of the petals that you're going to encounter are spineless. So we like to protect these large swaths of prickly pear cactus out there, and you can see a lot of them growing pretty close to the road. So go out there in early July and you will see some of the most vibrant and beautiful blossoms that you can witness on Nantucket. In early and mid-May, in the protected coastal heathlands on Coatue, you are also likely to find some really interesting characters in there too. Pink lady slippers, which are usually classified as a forest understory species, can be found in the exposed heathlands of Coatue. I don't really have an explanation for why this is. It's possible that there is some existing root structure underneath the ground that supports some more shelter from that sand and salt. But for some reason, the lady slippers love it out there. And I have seen some very dense accumulations of this species that I haven't found in some of the other forests on Nantucket. This is also home, as I found out this year, to a really interesting species of millipede. It's a larger species of millipede that was, until this year, was only documented on Tuckernuck Island, our little satellite off to the west. So the uplands are vibrant, and they're often battered and kept low because of that salt spray and wind, but the wetlands really dominate on Coatue. There are acres and acres of vibrant, biodiverse, and bio-rich salt marsh on the island that hosts a huge amount of species. These are the nurseries for many of our feeder fish and sport fish. It's also a source of a lot of clams as well, a lot of bivalves and things, and crabs spend at least some stage of their life cycle in the protected salt marshes on Coatue and in the rest of the harbor. The tidal flats on Coatue really come alive later in the season. That sea lavender pictured down in the left-hand corner is a really beautiful coloration in the late summer, standing out against that vibrant green of the Salicornia, the little, I call them marsh pickle, but the typical name is glasswort for that common species. And those tidal flats, when tide gets high and then goes back down again, is flushed with a huge amount of habitat for migrating shorebirds. Many shorebird species that we have that migrate up and down the East Coast that make journeys of several thousand miles, they use the tidal flats and marshes of Coatue as refueling stations. Really important part of that balance. So on top of the species that breed there, it's the species that are just passing through that need a quick refuel on their journey. The mussel beds as well on Coatue, nice and dense, nice and rich with blue mussels, and they help to support our American oyster catcher species. So the importance of Coatue as a recreation spot, as an ecological bastion, we started taking notice of this. And the foundation started acquiring property on Coatue in 1966. So only 3 years after our founding, we were purchased and were given some land on Coatue from the Abbotts, the Chapmans, and the Duggins. And understanding this, we decided that there was a benefit to having someone out on the property to help with any stranded boaters or motorists, and to make sure that nobody burned the place down, which is often the reason why rangers are helpful out on Coatue. Our first rangers on Coatue were Sarah Shedd and her husband, or her boyfriend at the time, Joel Davis. I was lucky to meet them a couple years ago, and they told me all about their experiences as the first Coatue Rangers, 1973 to 1975. They were students at UMass Amherst at the time. And Joel has unfortunately passed away in recent years, but Sarah has contributed some really great images depicting what it was like to spend the summer out on the at the Ranger cabin in the 70s. This cabin and the 3-acre parcel that it holds, were donated in 2019 to the foundation by the Craig family. For several decades, the Craigs allowed us to use this as the station for the Coatue Ranger, because they also saw the value of protecting this property and making sure that everyone was safe while they were out enjoying their day on Coatue. And I can tell you, it is one of the best places to spend a summer on the island. It is rustic. There is no running water. There is no power except for a small solar panel. And you are subjected to the same types of forces: salt spray, wind, clouds of mosquitoes. I'm really selling it. But this is one of my favorite places on the island and one of my favorite places in the world. You can wake up and have your coffee right on the harbor. And it is still maintained by the foundation and still the residents of the Coatue Ranger. Some important people who have held the mantle of Ranger or Shorebird Monitor over the years who deserve a shout out. Jerry and Ann Light held the Coatue Ranger job in the early 2000s when our shorebird work was really getting off the ground. Here's a couple pictures of them on the left-hand side. The incomparable Edie Ray spent many years as Shorebird Monitor and birder at large, working across Nantucket and Tuckernuck and Muskeget. She spent a huge amount of time, and she was the first person to take me out to Coatue. And I wouldn't be where I am today without the groundwork that she laid in our shorebird program. Some other notable rangers from over the years. I've delved into the memory banks of Nantucket Conservation Foundation to find some of these names. John Barrera was a ranger there in the 80s. Rick Blair, who I believe is still on island. He was during the 90s our ranger. Andy Harris and Nicole DuPont held the ranger position for 3 years, raising a small child in that ranger cabin, which is a feat unto itself. And I still, whenever I run into Nicole on island today, we always get into the conversation of, oh yeah, I painted those floors in the cabin seafoam green. And unfortunately, I've since painted over them, but that's okay. We'll let that go. And Jonathan Schuster had the job right before me, and he is still in Massachusetts. He's not on island anymore, but we got to hang out with him a couple of years ago and talk shop about Coatue and how things are going. But in 2014, I came to the island, and I saw this job posting of using my shorebird experience and living in a cabin, getting to deal with the public. And I kind of had these aspirational dreams of, it's part Edward Abbey, part Henry Beston, the outermost house. And I really connected with the heart of the job, protecting a really ecologically rich and beautiful part of the island, and also stewarding and shepherding these imperiled shorebirds through their season when we just want to get these chicks up on the wings and off fledging to warmer waters. And what I found when I came to Coatue was really a dream for a young ecologist. I was classically referred to, and my mom can attest to this, as a bird nerd in my mid-20s. And being immersed in an active mixed waterbird colony like this, I found some really beautiful reasons to appreciate this part of the island and appreciate Nantucket. This property is what connected me most to this community, and still kind of fuels what I do today a little bit. So I love being able to, in my current role, educate about this and talk about my experiences here. So thank you, NHA, for allowing me that. And that mixed waterbird colony is something to appreciate, something to hold up as a really important thing that Nantucket supports as an island. And the ranger job is great. You're driving along, you're walking miles of soft sand, you're subjected to clouds of mosquitoes, biting greenhead flies, and poison ivy as far as the eye can see. Sure, that's just part of the deal. But you also get to see Nantucket Harbor and Nantucket Town and the island from a completely different perspective, often the opposite perspective from someone who's standing on the bluffs down at the field station and looking across, or who's on a boat and wondering, I wonder who lives in that shack. It is a really rewarding part, a really rewarding job. And I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to try and maintain this property over the years. Blood, sweat, tears, and histamine reactions from mosquito bites, but that's a story for another time. The main reason that I connected with the Coatue Ranger job was protection of shorebirds. We had several species of shorebirds that we monitor and protect throughout the season, being the piping plover. There's a nest of piping plovers on top, and the American oyster catcher. Their nest is below. And that moment when you're watching a pair, you've been watching a pair court and make practice nests for a couple of weeks, and then you watch them lay a full clutch of eggs. The moment that you get to see that nest hatch is incredibly rewarding. And I've been lucky enough to find some plovers and oyster catchers on their hatch day and then watch them grow up throughout the season. American oyster catchers in particular are a species that Nantucket should be proud of. Like I said, Coatue, Great Point, Eel Point, Tuckernuck, this is the largest, densest breeding colony of American oyster catchers in this entire bird's range, which is most of the eastern seaboard. They are a long-lived, charismatic species. They have really amazing parental care that they exhibit. They tend to their chicks very closely. They teach them how to open mussels the way that they learned how to open mussels. They watch them and talk to them and shelter them from predators. Really beautiful and incredible species to appreciate out on Coatue. And we monitor their populations as they develop. We are part of the American Oyster Catcher Working Group, which is a collaborative group across states and international boundaries to monitor and report individual bands of American oyster catchers. When we identify a chick that is of bandable age, we go up and catch it. It usually stays in a same location around their nesting site. We very carefully approach and safely wrangle these little chicks. We put an individual color band on their leg. That is a band with an alphanumeric code that is unique to that individual, so that if someone spots it in its journey, it can be identified and reported. And it usually gets reported back to us that, oh, we found 8H down hanging out in Cedar Key, Florida. And it is usually in a group much like this picture on the bottom from Pat and Doris Leary. A huge collection of overwintering American oyster catchers down in Cedar Key, and some people with binoculars and spotting scopes to identify these individuals based on those bands that we put on them. We can track these individuals throughout their entire life, and we've noted several generational changes of chicks that were banded when they were growing up in their first season on Coatue, that wandered around for a few years and then came back to lay nests of their own on Coatue about 3 or 4 years later. And when you see that generational change, you can really appreciate the protection for the species and the value of just paying attention to shorebird nesting and conservation. And that is really a rewarding part of the Coatue Ranger job. Here's Brett Tetrault. He was our Coatue Ranger for the last 2 years, and he enjoyed striper fishing out there on the refuge and banding some oyster catchers. And right next to him is Karen Beatty, who it goes without saying, I would not be here today. I would not be in the position that I am, I wouldn't have been the Coatue Ranger without Karen's influence and the science team that she put together. They really made me want to keep coming back to the island, keep giving my best work. And for some reason, she just kept hiring me back as the ranger year after year. So Karen and I and all of our shorebird monitors have been lucky enough to watch these individuals grow up throughout their several year cycle, lay nests of their own, and continue that beautiful dance of shorebird conservation. And in my years of Coatue Rangering, I started noticing some things on the refuge that I was interested in. And Karen and the team that she put together at the Conservation Foundation, Jen Carberg, Danielle Odell, Kelly Omand, these people, and I'm glad to call coworkers now, really helped to support and bolster my own career initiatives. So what I was noticing with double-crested cormorants nesting on a coastal foredune using sandy substrate had not been documented before. And I said, there may be something here. And with their support, as well as the support of Nancy Seefelt over at Central Michigan University, I conducted my master's thesis study looking at the nesting ecology of these double-crested cormorants. They only started showing up in 2013. That was their first well-established colony on Coatue. Before then, they had nested on the end of the jetty starting in the early 2000s. But this sand nesting colony was something remarkable. And I documented a lot of the vegetation, the change around that colony, as well as when they moved colony sites, what happened to that coastal foredune. And these species fit pretty well into the fast-paced and early successional life on Coatue. Some people may complain that they eat the fish and they poop on the boats, but they are part of the ecosystem. They are part of our strong feeder fish population, and they are a really important part of Nantucket now. They're not going away, unfortunately. But Coatue is blessed not only with an ecological richness, but an appreciation of small moments. And if you are lucky enough to go out to the refuge, you can find some of these moments for yourself. Some times of peace, angling, or appreciating a sunset. it's worth the adventure and the hassle of getting all the way out to Coatue. And it's also worth protecting. The two major landowners on the refuge today, being the Conservation Foundation and the trustees, recognize that we are subjected to increasing pressures from storm influence, from wave action, and from erosion. And we recognize that this property has an importance to the island. It has an important recreational value and ecological value, and we would like to continue to protect that access and protect that resource going forward. So we're committing to a climate and coastal resiliency plan and initiative to bolster natural systems and the natural process of protection within these ecosystems. Diane Lang, who is the manager over at the trustees, she does a great job of monitoring the refuge on a regular basis. And unfortunately, she has had to close access to the refuge, driving access to the refuge, more in recent years, thanks to washover from strong waves and high tides. She's actually had to do that more than closures for shorebirds. So we're facing increasing pressures, we're facing increasing risk of losing access and losing some of the infrastructure that we have out there. So access and flooding is one of the things that the NCF and the trustees have identified as something that is valuable to protect. We're identifying risk areas, particularly the haulover and Coskata Pond and access to Great Point. We're researching and understanding these changes, and we're trying to bolster those natural systems in a way that is ecologically beneficial and something that we can modify on our end in a cost-effective way. Erosion of natural barriers, particularly dunes and beach ecosystems, any of those clay deposits that are exposed, is really important to us. So we're working with a PhD student out of Boston University named Sophia Tiggs, and she is studying sediment and erosion around the refuge, understanding how sediment is really moving and shaping around Coatue and Great Point in its current form, and identifying any places of potential infrastructure loss, because it's the places that we can actually put people up, there's not many of them, and out there they're exposed. And this is a picture from 2 winters ago during the Christmas bird count, where the tide was literally lapping at the door of the Coatue Ranger shack. So we need places like this to support that ongoing protection and conservation throughout for years to come. Also understanding that Coatue and Great Point as a barrier beach have a really important role to play when it comes to protection of our harbor. Not only the harbor water quality, but the species that live there, any of our eelgrass beds that cannot be subjected to stronger wave action. And if you eliminate the protection of Coatue, all of that strong northeast winds and the wave action that results from that is being directed towards the south shore of the harbor and the west side of the harbor, which is town, and putting all of that infrastructure, particularly residential infrastructure, at risk. So understanding these pressures and what we have to lose, we're really concerned with the future of the refuge and understanding the best way to protect it in a natural way. Now, all that being said, and I hope I didn't scare you away with the promise of mosquitoes and greenheads, this is really the best job on Nantucket, and I still refer to it as the best job on Nantucket, even after I've got this job, which I personally think is the best job on Nantucket. We are hiring the current Coatue Ranger for the 2023 season. So if you have someone who you think would be a good fit, who is a young ecologist who wants to immerse themselves in a really beautiful biodiverse part of Nantucket, send them our way. Come to nantucketconservation.org/employment, fill out an application. We are currently looking for the best person for this job. And with that, I will take any questions, and it looks like we have some good ones in the Q&A. Thank you very much, Nantucket Historical Association. Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, Miranda, for helping me put this on.
Thank you, Neil, for sharing about your experience living as a ranger out on Coatue and the interesting work you did with the shorebird monitoring. Very cool. So we have a few questions from our audience. What actions do you envision being deployed to remediate the loss of these barriers and protections?
It's a great question. I'm invested in the process as an educator, as an ecologist, and someone who understands Coatue, but I'm not a geologist. I am not a wetland ecologist in the way that my coworker, Dr. Jen Carberg, is. She's heading up our response to these initiatives. So I will defer to the work that she is doing on that. That being said, there are ways to slow down wave action that recreate natural buffers and natural soft armoring of exposed barrier beaches and marsh ecosystems. We've instituted in the last couple of years a protective oyster reef that is slowing wave action, helping to protect a marsh as it's regrowing. And there's some really interesting designs out there for living shorelines that can act as a natural, stable protection while also supporting a whole host of other species.
So, Neil, did you personally notice the impacts of climate change over the course of your 6 seasons on Coatue?
I did notice a significant amount of flooding, particularly around neap tides in the spring. May, June were always high tide events, and you would have sections of the road flooded out. That seemed to increase over time, and we have done some protections of some of those tidal overlay areas. So anywhere where water is naturally going to be reabsorbed into the marsh ecosystem, we want to make sure that stays in place and protecting the vegetation that are surviving there. I have definitely seen a lot of erosion around the cabin, loss of entire cedar trees where the underlying peat and soil has been eroded away by wave action. And we've had some collapse of cedar trees in just that part of Coatue in the last few years. And like I said, I second what Diane has said to people, where she's had to close the refuge and access from driving because of strong waves out of the east and northeast. So that east beach is the main access point via driving through the haul over and up. And if you close that, you cut off so much of the refuge, except for boating access. So I've definitely seen that problem exacerbating. And if you look at maps of the east side of the island, you know, that sediment is constantly moving. Those longshore currents are constantly pushing sand north and rounding Great Point. And you've seen Great Point kind of shift a little bit to the west. And yeah, there's been some significant changes in my time as a ranger.
Wow, that's incredible that you yourself observed that just in your short duration out there. So another question, do you think the wild cranberries blew over from the bogs?
Wild cranberries. I actually have not found cranberries growing on Coatue. It's not saying that there isn't. There's some isolated little pockets of fresh water inside there, but cranberries really don't like a ton of salt spray. So there are wild cranberries growing in certain parts of the island. There's a cranberry swale in the middle, in the heart of Eel Point, that is, you know, tucked down below in between two larger dunes, and the swale in between holds a nice little cranberry bog. But I haven't found any cranberries out on Coatue and Great Point.
Okay, well, our participant David will have to let Neil know where you found those wild cranberries.
Yeah.
Neil, and I'm curious, what was your most memorable moment out there on Coatue? Was there a particular experience that really made an impression? You were talking about how your time out there was most impactful in sort of developing that love of Nantucket.
I mean, it's lots of little moments out there. I've met some really amazing people that I still encounter in my life on the mainland of Nantucket. But I would say probably some of the most impactful moments were encountering a hatch day. Like you watch a pair of birds for that long doing their dance, protecting the nest. You know, sometimes you got to move people down the beach and just be like, they're at a really vulnerable stage. Like we just need this nest to hatch. We need these chicks to get up on their wings, and you time it effectively from the date that the first clutch becomes full, and you arrive at the nest site and you can find a chick just breaking out of its egg, or just sticking its little beak through and pipping the eggshell. It's really kind of magical, and it's like you encounter this individual on their first day in the world, and then you get to protect them as they're starting to grow up. Then you get to see them throughout their life stage, and when it's really rewarding when they come back and lay nests of their own, because it's like, oh, it's really full circle there. So the life of a shorebird monitor is incredibly beneficial, and it's really impactful. I was lucky enough to do shorebird monitoring for 9 years, and it's something I'll definitely carry with me.
And you said you were a bird nerd. When did your love of birds start? Was it before your time on Nantucket?
Yeah, I spent a few years as a wandering ecologist, usually following different birds. I worked a couple other shorebird monitor jobs. I worked for university up in Canada studying waterfowl behavior. I worked in wildlife rehabilitation with raptors up in Vermont. Yeah, I was a certified bird nerd before I came to Nantucket, but it only improved while I was here. And there's such a great birding community on the island. Some really amazing people that I've learned from and met over the years in the birding community out here.
Well, there's plenty of birds and passionate bird lovers here. Well, thank you again, Neil, for sharing your knowledge and enthusiasm and time with us tonight. Also, thank you, NHA members, for enabling these free public programs through your support. So everyone, have a wonderful evening. And for those of you on Nantucket or in New England, stay warm this weekend.